Even with stories like that of the Chesapeake Candle Company, experts say that they still would not bet on the Made in the USA, that it's making a comeback. For more on the state of American manufacturing, I spoke to Chad Moutray, chief economist for the National Association of Manufacturers.
Well, I think that where you're going to see jobs come back is from new opportunities. And so you're seeing that increased competitiveness of the U.S. really taking a hold. I think the part of the reason why so many people are looking at the U.S. as a viable location to produce things is because of that increased productivity. The Boston Consulting Group estimates, 600,000 to 1.2 million manufacturing jobs could be added in the U.S. between now and 2020. I think that's a pretty reasonable assessment. Probably half of that figure will come from shale and the increased advantages that the U.S. has because of energy. The other part of it is kind of related to that other part, and that is that productivity gains, technology and productivity have made U.S. manufacturers a lot more competitive on the global scale.
A lot of people have been very vocal about the fact that it's expensive to hire people in America. There are a lot of legal issues. It's expensive to build a plant, especially when you compare it to other places like whether it's India, China, Bangladesh, or any other place where there's a major manufacturing hub.
Certainly we've seen relative labor costs narrow quite a bit in recent years. But you're right, labor is one of the more expensive components of any manufacturing process, and I think finding a way to reduce those costs, a lot of that has to do with regulations, to be honest with you. And when U.S. manufacturers are looking at locations to build new plants and new facilities, they're looking at costs like, how much is energy? What is the legal environment? What are the regulatory environment that's going to be they're going to be facing? And on that scale, the U.S. actually is not as attractive as it should be. We've had a lot of studies that have actually said that the U.S. is at a disadvantage relative to many of our trading partners when it comes to our regulatory environment. Our tax environment is the highest in the world in terms of our marginal tax rates. And certainly in terms of even workforce development, almost every manufacturer that I talk to says that they're struggling to find talent. And so, trying to find ways that, yes, we become more competitive in some ways, but in other ways, we really have to address our business environment and that tax and regulatory structure.
Is the solution something similar to what the president has recently proposed back in February of adding several $100 million to help retrain workers? I mean, does it come from the top down, or is this retraining, or should it be done by universities and technical colleges or companies themselves, perhaps?
Well, I think it's all a partnership. I think it's very encouraging that the president continues to talk about manufacturing very vocally, almost in every speech, and I think that's encouraging. But I think that it's a partnership in general. I think manufacturers need to work very closely with educational institutions, local governments, to be able to really drive home that workforce of the future. Again, when I talk to manufacturers around the country, almost every one of them says that they're having trouble finding talent. And so we need to be able to steer more of our workforce into manufacturing jobs. And that means more STEM education, more science, technology, engineering, and math, but also a greater focus on the trades, welding, mechanics, all of those kind of skills that we certainly have lost track of here in the U.S. And the last leg of that puzzle is changing perceptions. Manufacturing is beloved in the United States. When you ask people about making things in America, everyone gets kind of a patriotic pride. And yet we've drifted away from that blue-collar work and that stigma attached to it. And we need to drive more people back into working for manufacturers, convincing them that it is a high-paying, high-skilled job.
There's a very global supply chain that's involved in manufacturing, unlike it where it was 20 years ago.
Yes.
How does that impact manufacturers in the U.S.? Does the United States, are we focused on being the final assembly? Are we focused on building all the parts here? Which part do we want to play the biggest role in, and how does the rest of the world, this geopolitical concerns, ultimately impact that entire global supply chain?
Well, I think you make a good point. Manufacturing is certainly global, and I think U.S. manufacturers are aware that we're in a global environment where 95% of the world's customers live outside of our borders. We also live in a world where supply chains are very intermingling, and I think with that challenge, I think our goal is to make sure that as much of that production as possible takes place in the U.S. That's why we're pushing for pro-growth policies that will allow us to have a competitive tax environment, regulatory environment, and a workforce that really will allow more companies to want to locate here. So I think that's the ultimate goal for manufacturers, at least in the U.S., is let's make more in the U.S., let's have an environment that really facilitates that, and let's try to open up borders so that we can continue to trade more with the rest of the world. We're pushing very aggressively for passage of the free trade agreements both with Asia and with Europe, and we hope that the President gets the Trade Promotion Authority so that we can push those through the Congress. We also are pushing for the Ex-Im Bank to be reauthorized later this fall. So I think all of those things help to open up new markets for U.S. manufacturers, but also keeping in mind that we want to make as much here as we can.